How do you prove that something is true? Is seeing believing? Or can one's eyes lie? Some principles lend themselves to experimentation and confirmation. Are we to judge, like in a court of law, on the grounds of proof beyond reasonable doubt? What about stories or events that cannot be corroborated at all? What criteria should we use to accept or reject such narratives? We now turn to Mrs. Shimona Cukiernik, an international lecturer and founder of OMEC, a nonprofit organization dedicated to in-depth transformational learning and living. Mrs. Cukiernik will speak about the holiday of Shavuot and the revelation at Mount Sinai, and will discuss fact versus fallacy, and how a thinking individual can learn to sort between the two.
Hi, what I'd like to look at today is something connected with Shavuot, the festival of the giving of the Torah. It's coming up soon. And the festival, the Yom Tov, celebrates the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. It's what we base all of our actions on. All of Jewish life is based on that. So if one wants to think of a Grundnorm, the basic principle from which all laws are derived in society, one could look at that in the following way. Here in New York, as all New Yorkers will tell you, they are frustrated by alternate side of the road parking rules. So on Mondays and Thursdays and Tuesdays and Fridays, you can't park on alternate side of the road. Where does that come from? Those laws come from the laws of the city. But where does the city get the authority to decide that? From the state laws. And the state gets its authority from the federal laws, which get their authority from the Constitution. So we could say that the Constitution, originally written by the founding fathers of this country, is the Grundnorm for all laws that follow. So too, when we look at the giving of the Torah, that moment in time, that event, is the basis, the authority upon which all other laws are established. So if we're told, you know what, you can't eat meat and milk together, and you have to turn off your BlackBerry and every other electronic gadget in your home at candle lighting time on the 7th day of the week, etc., etc., you have to put on tefillin or pray 3 times a day. Where does that come from? On what basis do we have to do that? Supposedly because God gave the Torah on Mount Sinai. Now, any thinking, responsible person is going to ask the question, well, how do I know that's true? How do I know it happened? If it happened, then yes, I'm ready to live my life in a way that might be beyond my comfort zone. If it didn't happen, then you think I'm going to cover my hair with a wig? You think I'm going to wake up at the crack of dawn or stay up all night on the Yom Tov of Shavuot learning? We're not going to put ourselves out like that. Any person who is thinking and responsible, has some depth, is going to ask, how do I know it's true? Now, all religions lay claim to truth. And whereas it's a given that each religion has elements of truth in it, it's impossible by logical deduction, just being rational. Now, whereas all religions have aspects of truth, it's impossible that all of them are true because they're mutually contradictory. So, for example, Islam claims that Muhammad is the Messiah, and Judaism claims that Mashiach is going to redeem us. His identity is unclear. It's not stated specifically, but we're told there is going to be a Redeemer. Certainly, Judaism doesn't hold that the Redeemer is Muhammad, and Christianity says that that Redeemer is Jesus. So these things contradict each other. Take another example. Jews would say that when Abraham brought a child up on the altar to potentially sacrifice him to God, that child was Isaac, whereas Islam says that child was Ishmael. So clearly there might be elements of truth in all of those religions, but they can't all be true. How do we know that Judaism is true? How is our claim different? Now, the first thing to realize is that we're not the first to ask these questions. They've been asked by some of the greatest minds in history, some of the greatest Jews who ever lived. They've addressed this question: how do we know it's true? Why are we doing what we're doing? And one of those sages, authorities, who addressed this issue is Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. He wrote a book called The Kuzari, and it tells the story of the king of Khuzar, who interviews a Christian priest and a Muslim leader, and then finally a Jew in his search for truth. And the book is an account of his conversation with this rabbi, asking him, whom do you believe created the world? On what basis do you claim to be a representative in touch with the truth, etc.? And he sets up two premises right at the outset before he even gets into the conversation. The first is this: we have to realize that the conditions for divine revelation don't lie within ourselves. What that means is a person can prepare themselves, can refine themselves to be sensitive and open to divine revelation, but you can't make that happen. That's because we are created by God and we don't create Him. I am in His image and not He in mine. If I could deductively work from where I am to the truth, then really the truth that I'm arriving at is simply a projection of my own mind. But if I'm trying to come to a truth that is infinitely beyond me, then that's what it is, infinitely beyond me. And if I move 1 mile or 1,000,000 miles closer towards infinity, I've not come any closer. Therefore, the Kuzari says, those conditions for divine revelation are in the realm of the divine. I can do what I can to prepare myself, but they don't lie within me. The second point grows out from that, namely, that as a result of this, a true religion must erupt spontaneously. It doesn't evolve. If I could deductively arrive at the truth, progressively refining myself, then we could say, well, a group of people evolved spiritually over a period of time and came to the truth. But if we're saying those conditions don't lie within me, then by necessity we have to say that religions erupt, true religions erupt spontaneously, as opposed to just evolving over time. Now, if a religion does erupt spontaneously and it meets certain criteria, then we can say it's true. What are those criteria? The Kuzari says as follows: when we look at what was going on at the time of the giving of the Torah and what happened at the precise moment of the giving of the Torah, we see various facts that are criteria for truth. And amongst those, he lists the following. All the people, the entire nation, had gone through similar events over the course of many years in the land of Egypt. At least that's the claim. We're not saying yet that that's the truth, but we're seeing how Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, the author of the Kuzari, sets up the logic. So he says the claim is that all of the people experienced the suffering in Egypt. They also all experienced the plagues, which was over the course of almost a full year. They went out from Egypt together. They crossed the Sea of Reeds together. And they had a simultaneous experience of the giving of the Torah. And every one of them was present. That's very important. He says the claim is every member of our nation, of the Jewish people, was present at the giving of the Torah. Furthermore, they experienced the same things. They lived together over a course of 40 years in the desert. Why does Rabbi Yehuda Halevi stress that the entire nation experienced this? He stresses that they had a common history, that they had a common present, a common future, and that they were all there at the moment of the giving of the Torah. Why is that so important? We can take a cue from something that a philosopher of science, Karl Popper, says about scientific theory. Although we're speaking about history and whether something in the realm of history is fact or myth, whether it's a story or it actually happened, Karl Popper presents a very interesting statement that we can apply to verification of historical events or supposed events. He says as follows: any theory which is not refutable is not a scientific theory. Now, what does that mean? A theory, in order to be considered scientific, has to expose itself to being false. It has to be willing to put itself in the realm of being tested. If you can't test that theory, then it's not a scientific theory. So let's say, for example, someone says, at sea level, water boils at 100 degrees. It will always boil at 100 degrees. Well, I can test that out. I can take water, light a match at sea level, and measure the temperature and see at which point am I going to see that water boiling. I can check that out. Someone says if you take 2 parts hydrogen and 1 part oxygen, you'll get water. Or hydrogen is lighter than oxygen. All of those are scientific theories because I can check them out. They expose themselves to being proven false. But let's say someone says Martians travel the universe and we just haven't seen them because we don't have the technology to access that. Well, that may be true, but I can't prove it to be false or true. It doesn't expose itself to being refuted, and therefore that is a non-scientific statement. Now let's apply that to the realm of history. As long or as soon as we claim that something happened, if it's in the past, that's not immediately verifiable. I need certain criteria to be met so that I'll be able to accept, did that actually happen? Is it history? Or is that something I'll relegate to the realm of myth? So for example, when we speak about the battle at Waterloo or Bunker Hill, World War II, the Holocaust, the Spanish Inquisition, the destruction of the temple, anything like that, the Roman Empire, we accept that as fact, as history. When it comes to myths, let's say Greek or Roman mythology, the story of Icarus, we say that that's a realm of story, something that is made up, because I can't actually prove it. I mean, someone may say, well, there are certain myths that make so little sense, it's just not possible that they happened. But there are other stories that we tell of that hypothetically could have happened, but they don't expose themselves to being checked to see, did this actually happen or not? And therefore we make a distinction historically and not just scientifically between whether something is historical fact or fiction. Now, if you think about it, most religions, in fact, almost every single religion, is really relegated to the realm of myth. No religion bases its claim to truth on something that can be verified or proven false. So let's say, for example, Islam says, well, Muhammad stood at the Temple Mount and jumped to the seventh heaven. How do I know that that happened? I'm not saying it didn't happen, but how can I prove that? Who were the witnesses, and how many witnesses were there? Jesus rose from the dead. That's the claim in front of 3 people. Well, that may have happened, but I can't prove it either way. I can't prove that it did happen, and I can't prove that it didn't happen, because there were only 3 witnesses, and they could have corroborated, they could have colluded together and worked things out so that their stories were covered and came to the people and said, well, folks, this is what happened, and, take it or leave it, but we're telling you that it happened. So almost every religion in the world is really relegated to what I would call the realm of myth, made-up story, make-believe. You can choose to believe it if you want, but you're going to be taking a leap of faith, jumping into it. Judaism is entirely different. The claim of Judaism is every single one of our people were there. There is not one other religion that will claim to mass revelation. Why? Because such a claim could certainly be refuted. Exactly fits into Karl Popper's theory of what scientific theory is about. If you say every member of our people was there, you can certainly prove whether that was true or not. Let's say that's the claim, and not everyone was there. So in the very next generation, a kid comes along to a parent and says, Mom, Dad, I've been told, I was hanging out with my friends and they're saying that a couple of years ago, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, the entire nation stood together and heard the word of God from Mount Sinai. Is that true? And the parent says to the kid, I don't know if God spoke to the people. I wasn't there. So in that instant, you've proven the claim to be false. It really exposes itself, that claim. It opens itself up to being proven. You know what, folks? That didn't happen. That is hogwash. But if everyone did experience that, then the next generation comes to the adults and says, did that happen? And everyone says, yes, it did. That's really powerful. And that's why the Torah stresses over and over again that the entire people were there. Because you can't make that kind of thing up. You can't fabricate a lie of that scale. So if we put forward the thought, it's all a lie, it's made up. My challenge to you is to think about, when did that lie become so accepted? Either it was a deliberate con, Moses was a deliberate con man, or it was unintentional. The people kind of fell into believing this myth and everyone bought into it. Because we have no history of a group of people who said that did not happen. I'm not talking about now, post-Holocaust. Hitler, Stalin, they brought their destruction. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about after that event supposedly happened. Even the Sadducees didn't deny the fact that God had given the Torah on Mount Sinai. Yes, they said, well, we can challenge the validity of the oral law, but no one challenged the validity of the written law. Because how could you make a lie like that up? And let's say it was later. Either it was at that moment in time when the Jews were in the desert, or it was going to be later. Someone comes along. It wasn't a Moses, but deliberately trying to con the people, fabricate this lie, and says, guess what, folks? We all received the Torah at Mount Sinai. When would that happen? There were many, many people. The claim is there were many people at that event. The claim is 600,000 males between the age of 20 and 60, and they were married. So we're already holding at 1.2 million people. That's not counting the adults over 60. It's not counting the children people had. And along with that claim goes the claim that many children were born at each birth. The woman experienced multiple births in Egypt. And it also doesn't include the converts, the Erev Rav that came along with the people when they left Egypt. So we're looking at roughly 3 million people in the desert. How do you get 3 million people to buy into that lie and pass it on to the next generation? It's not possible. Think of yourself and just your nuclear immediate family. Think of sitting down at the dinner table and trying to kind of convince your family that all of you were in New York this afternoon, kind of sightseeing, and you went up the Eiffel Tower and someone was eating ice cream and dropped it on the floor. I don't know, come up with any story. Would you be able to convince just the people around your table, whether it's 3 people or 5 people, 20 people, that you all did that together? Impossible. Intelligent people don't buy into that lie, let alone 3 million people don't buy into that lie. There were many, many different kinds of people. The claim is that there were men and women and children. There were rich people, poorer people. There were intellectuals, simple people, artists, scientists, spiritual people, creative, mystical people. That's what we're told. How does a lie of that proportion come to be accepted? It would never happen today. And people in the past certainly weren't more simple than we were. So if someone came along and said, this is what happened, there would certainly be a group of people who said, no, folks, that did not happen. So at some level, the very next generation, the very generation after the giving of the Torah, those children who were born in the desert and whose parents had experienced Shavuot, had experienced the giving of the Torah, had the same step to take as you do, as we do in this generation. They had to listen to the testimony of the previous generation. And that generation unanimously said, yes, we were all there. We all heard it. We all saw it. We heard those first 2 commandments from God himself. There was not one person who denied that testimony, because if there was, we would have heard about that today. So I'd like to conclude by reading a letter. We don't normally do texts, but I'd like to read a letter of the Lubavitcher Rebbe to this effect about the giving of the Torah. It's from volume 2 of Letters of the Rebbe, page 14, and he says as follows: we know that this, meaning the giving of the Torah, is a fact because millions of Jews in our day accept it as such because they received it as such from their own parents. And these millions in turn received the evidence from the previous generation, and so on, in an uninterrupted chain of transmitted evidence from millions to millions of witnesses, generation after generation, back to the original millions of witnesses who saw the event with their very own eyes. Among these original witnesses, there were many who were initiated in the sciences of the day, meaning Egypt, many achievements of which are still baffling nowadays. Among them were philosophers and thinkers, as well as ignorant and uneducated persons. There were men, women, and children of all ages, yet all of them reported the event and phenomena connected with it without contradiction to one another. Such a fact is certainly indisputable. I do not believe that there is another fact which can match it for evidence and accuracy. To deny such a fact is anything but scientific. It is the very opposite of science. So I would challenge someone who says to me, prove to me that the giving of the Torah happened, with the following: prove to me that it didn't. It would be much more difficult to prove that it didn't happen than that it did, because the claim is every single person was there. Obviously, that still leaves us with a bunch of questions. For example, how do we know that the experience that the people had at the giving of the Torah, so it happened, but how do we know that it was an authentic experience? And furthermore, how do we know the tradition was handed down intact? But we don't have time to go into that today. and Jews are always left with questions. Maybe another time. Good Yom Tov.